Hi, this is Warren Sprouse. You're on the Bible Forum. I'm always happy when the music starts. It makes me feel so good. We're here every Sunday night from 8 until 10 p.m. Eastern Standard, now Daylight Savings Time, and we look at life through a biblical lens, and we generally solve all the world's problems in 2 hours or less. This is the Sunday before our election, our presidential election. True or false? In 59 voting districts in the Philadelphia region, Obama received 100% of the votes with not even a single vote recorded for Romney. True or false? True! It's a mathematical and statistical impossibility. In 21 districts in Wood County, Ohio, Obama received 100% of the votes, where the GOP inspectors, monitors, were removed from their polling locations. Illegally, I might add. And not one single vote was recorded for Romney. Did I mention the statistical impossibility? In Wood County, Ohio, 106,258 people voted in a county with only 98,213 eligible voters. In St. Lucie County, Florida, there were 175,474 registered eligible voters, but 247,713 votes were cast. The National Seal Museum, a polling location in St. Lucie County, Florida, had 158% voter turnout. In Palm Beach County, Florida, 141% voter turnout. In one Ohio county, Obama won by 108% of the total number of eligible voters. That's how many he won by. Barack Obama won in every state that did not require a photo ID, and lost in every state that did. Now do you understand why people run around and say, we need to have an ID system? But every time the election comes up, there's an outcry, and this election cycle is no different. In the last 4 years, several states have passed new laws to limit the types of documents that are accepted at polls. And the critics go on and on claiming that these are designed to keep minorities, older citizens, and people of color from voting. Well, what is going on here? Are they telling the truth? Is that real? And you have to admit, statistically, if no other way, that that's a possibility. And maybe it is actually happening in places. We don't know. Well, in some states, a birth certificate is required in order to get a state ID. In other states, it takes a driver's license from that particular state. In most states, I would assume it takes a birth certificate to get the driver's license. But this is what's being called a deliberate attempt to limit people from voting in America, that we actually know who it is that's getting the driver's license or the state ID. But the issue is voter fraud. How do you control for that? And the sub-issue here is personal responsibility. Who doesn't have a birth certificate? Well, many people don't have one in their possession, and that for a number of reasons. Students at school in other states, they don't carry their birth certificate around with them. Other people who may never have had one in their lives, like me. I was in my 60s before I realized that what I had was not a birth certificate. Who doesn't have a driver's license from the state in which they vote? Again, older people, people who don't drive, and at least one state school teacher who's being featured as an illustration and apparently lives in Wisconsin but has an Illinois driver's license. We don't know why. along with students matriculating in states other than where they legally reside. But are these illustrations of voter discrimination? I would suggest to you no. Not on their face it isn't. Now it could be, but it doesn't appear to be. What it is an illustration of how casual Americans have become regarding the rule of law and personal responsibility. Let me explain it to you. I mentioned a little bit ago that I lived 60 years on this planet before securing a birth certificate. That's not irresponsibility on my part. What I had was a document from the hospital, actually from my mother, legally called a notification of live birth. We learned all about that when Obama got elected and Hillary started complaining that he wasn't a citizen. For most of my life, that notification of live birth, and it had footprints, my little feet on there. Fingerprints from my mom, footprints from the baby. Big piece of paper. It was great. But it was sufficient. It worked like a birth certificate for 60 years. I grew up in New Jersey. I needed a birth certificate to get a driver's license. Not a problem. Everywhere I went, anytime I needed it, it was there for me. And I just assumed it was a birth certificate. That's the way it worked. Until I applied for a passport. Now realize laws changed from 1961 when I got my driver's license, or was it 60? It would be 60. And the year 2000 whatever, when I was applying for a passport. I actually walked in at the UNCW in Wilmington, North Carolina, University of North Carolina, Wilmington. They had a place in there. It was a pretty good sized room, and you walked in, and it was a long, thin kind of a room. It was 50 feet wide, but it was longer than it was wide. And as I walked in, there was a young fellow at the counter, had to have been 30 feet away from that door. And as I walked through the door, he just raised up, looked at me, and said, "That's not a birth certificate." I said, "What?" Look behind me. You talking to me? He knew from a distance that weren't no birth certificate. I was surprised, shocked, I tell you. Are they discriminating against me? No. Societies have changed. Laws have changed. Laws have been adjusted to compensate. Is it overkill? Well, as I was standing there, in my mind, in my circumstance, yeah, it was a little bit overkill. I'm legal. I've got documents all over the place. I've worked and paid taxes, and, I'm not a problem over here. I'm not a criminal. I'm not a threat. I just want to get a passport. It would not be a problem for me to have a passport based on what I had in my hand, at least for the last 60-some years. So what did I do? Well, I stood my ground, and I got a lawyer, and I made their lives miserable. No. I went out the door. I went home. I got on my computer. I found the state in which I was born, which is Wilmington, Delaware. That's where the hospital was. That's where my mother was. I filled out the form. I sent the $35, and 3 weeks later, I had a birth certificate in my hand. If this had been a voting issue, I would not have been able to vote in that particular election. Would that have been discrimination? Yes. Yes, it would have been. They are discriminating. Only citizens with valid legal birth certificates are entitled to a passport. And increasingly in states around here, to vote. Because the government is responsible to regulate these sorts of things. And they are entitled, empowered to make whatever laws they choose to accomplish that goal. My responsibility as a citizen was to make sure I understood the laws and comply before I needed to have that passport. Were they discriminating against me racially or socially? No, not on the face of it. They didn't even know me. Of course, it could have been. No. I had my radio show in town for almost 20 years. Maybe they didn't like me. But we have the right to legal redress for the immoral or unjust laws. What we don't have are exceptions for poor planning or for the ignorance on my part. Citizens of a country have a personal, moral, legal responsibility to know the law in their state and comply. You move to another state, you have an obligation to know what those laws are. The driving laws in New Jersey are a little different than the driving laws in Charleston, South Carolina, I can tell you. And I quite honestly don't know for sure if I'm obeying the law in all of these circumstances, but I am certain that what I'm doing is safe. And it's oftentimes, when there's a question, it's oftentimes better than what somebody's doing in front of me. In all 50 states, governments bend over backwards to make certain citizens know the changes and have access to whatever it takes to adjust to those changes. But in the end, it's my responsibility. And that citizens are not paying attention, aren't interested until they need something, like me and my passport, or don't exercise the necessary responsible or moral requirements, like moving to a new state and not getting the driver's license from that particular state, or attending college in another state and not even thinking about what it takes to vote in that state or some other thing that you might need, doesn't constitute unlawful discrimination on the part of any state. I lived over 50 years in New Jersey. I voted every chance I got. It was always required that you present a valid ID, and then you signed the book. I lived 20 plus years in North Carolina. I voted there every time, and voting there meant simply walking in and announcing who you were and where you lived, and them saying, okay. And the first time that happened, I said, no. What do you mean? Don't you want to see my voter card or my... No. You told me where you lived and who you are. Go over there. And they had a sign for S's, some Sprouse. And they had my name in the book, and I signed. No, I didn't sign. They just checked the name. Okay. And there you were. When I asked them questions, they were shocked. What are we talking about? And here in South Carolina, it's no different. Just tell them who you are. If you're in the book, you can vote. In a world where people can easily pretend to be someone they are not, in a world as technically oriented as this, where things and people are not necessarily what they seem, to simply show a legal ID is neither overt nor is it demeaning. It's just simply the right thing to do. It's what government is about, structuring societies for decency and for order. The citizen of a state or of a county has the moral and the legal responsibility to, one, know the laws, and second, conform to them. Ignorance is no excuse. Have you tried that in court? It's as natural as falling off a log. And the fact that we've made this a major issue in our society is a testimony to the continuing efforts of government to control who votes, something that has been abused in the past in many states, and people who either don't like or don't understand change or want everything handed to them. Somehow a sizable number of adults aren't able to get a legal document to go into the DMV and have their picture taken and get a card Doesn't even cost anything in most cases. But they are able to get a host of other legal documents: food stamps, insurance, grocery store discount cards, and who knows what else. We are raising a nation of children. Children who want to be able to play, meaning they want to be able to do whatever they want, but they don't want to live with the consequences of that immaturity or that ignorance. Well, governments are not responsible, nor are they able to mother every citizen, to make sure that you have everything that you are entitled to. Sooner or later, you have to grow up, and you have to take responsibility for yourself and do what you're supposed to do if you want to vote.